Hey everybody, it's Stuart, and today I want to talk about the mindset of leadership. For most people, they think that leadership is just something that's vested into a person from another higher level of authority. In reality, what I find is that the quality of leadership is the quality of the conversations that you can hold. And why this is so important and why 6 conversations and not more, well, I haven't discovered any more of them yet that fit in other categories. So let's talk about all these 6 so that you can get a sense of what they are, and let's see whether they have practical applications for you. The first one is connection. We all know that authentic connection makes a leader well-liked and well-founded, so that whenever they need to execute any kind of mission or they need to do any kind of task, the team is behind them. Number 2 is setting expectations. A good leader is also able to get down to operational work, deliver tasks, and be able to achieve some kind of result by setting expectations for the team. What are you expected to work on? How are you expected to work on it? And how are you expected to work with each other? These kinds of expectations typically lay the ground foundation for culture to be developed and for performance to be elevated. The third thing is feedback. Now, most of the time, feedback is deemed as a thing that you don't do. I mean, it's easy for a leader to say, go there, and people will go there. But to sit down and listen to someone give you feedback, wow, that's going to be a tall order, isn't it? So here's the thing. In giving and receiving feedback, all parties have a role to play. The leader needs to know how to give effective feedback, but also know how to receive good feedback. For example, it's very common for us to think of the leader as the feedback giver rather than the feedback receiver. But let's be honest, leaders are humans. They too need feedback. Otherwise, how are they going to provide you with the things that you need in order to do the things that you need to do well in? So whenever a leader is receiving feedback, it's a state of sitting down and opening the space for collaboration. In fact, it is a co-created future between leader and follower. The leader usually will start off by preparing himself or herself in order to open up their hearing as well as their heart so that they can truly listen. So that whenever the first spiel comes out, it might be just a series of complaints, and I know many leaders don't like listening to complaints, but you can actively listen in order to manage that spiel of negativity and get down to what really is the root cause of the problem so that you can indeed solve it. So that's the first thing, to be able to receive, to be able to hear clearly what the other person is saying and to reflect it back to them. And more often than not, this manner of listening itself is very likely to engender a closer bonding, but also help the other person to notice that you are genuine. The leader, therefore, has to take note of this in order to be able to execute. In other words, there are only a few things that you can do. Either encourage the person, remove the obstacle, or push the person forward. So there are only a few things that you can do. Either to encourage the person by pushing and supporting the other person forward and say, for example, there's not much we can do, but hang in there. That's a form of encouragement, right? And then the other set of activities you can do is to get down to the problem, sort out the process, and work towards alleviating the obstacle or bottleneck, which sometimes also helps to flourish a relationship in the first place. So as you're listening and you're gathering feedback, the difficult part is when you're gathering feedback about yourself. Now, not all leaders are open to listening to this because they too have an ego, but I do recommend holding the space, opening your heart for listening, and also accepting that there's some things that you too need to fix. So when you hear something that is reasonable, you can say, that sounds like a reasonable request, let me see whether I can do something about it. If it's an unreasonable request, you can simply say, that sounds like a pretty tall order, let me think about how that could benefit the rest of the organization, and I'll get back to you. Always remember though, that the feedback loop needs to be closed by you taking action and enabling others to see that you have taken action. The other side of the equation is leaders giving feedback. It's not just telling people what to do, it's the diligence of observation. How do you pay attention to people during their work and your workday? Are you absent so that you don't pay attention to their work? Are you always hawking over them so that you're micromanaging? That's not necessarily the best way to give feedback. However, most of the time it's done during an onboarding period, then later periodically throughout the work year. You don't want to only go to the person to give feedback when it's absolutely necessary at the end of the year because it's going to be too late. Instead, you want to observe them in a concerted fashion. If they're new, you want to pay attention more closely to them for the first 7 to 21 days or more. depending on the nature of the complexity of the job. So if it's really complex, you may need to go in and give a lot more feedback. But if you find that it doesn't require that much feedback because it's a simple job, then you don't have to spend even more than 2 days doing it. However, I find that the onboarding process is also a relationship building process. You invest some time into this so that the relationship is stable throughout the rest of the years. Now, when you're giving feedback, you have got to state it in terms of its situation, what actually happened, what the person did, and how it impacted the downstream. So for example, I noticed that you picked up the phone call. You were a little bit gruff with the customer, and that might impact our brand in the long run. So what you might want to do in such a situation instead is, instead of getting on the phone immediately, take a pause, get yourself centered, and then answer the call. Do you think you'll be able to do that? So this kind of feedback mechanism is based on reality, what's not well executed versus what you would like to see executed a little bit better. Just bear in mind that in giving very, very specific behaviors, you might be seen as micromanaging. Instead, you might want to say that, oh, the impact on the customer might detrimentally affect our business. So here's what I suggest. Under such situation, do this behavior because it is going to help us to elevate the customer's view of the company, and that will be in line with our mission in serving customers well. How do you see it? Am I missing anything? So this is also a cycle. When you ask those two final questions, it also allows them to clarify. It allows it to be an open two-way conversation so that feedback can be precise. Of course, there's so many more things about feedback, but I'll leave it as that for the time being. The next kind of conversation is known as the coaching or development conversation. This is where you sit down with an individual and you run through something called the GROW model: goals, reality, options, and way forward. The way by which you conduct a coaching conversation really requires you to be comfortable not knowing an answer, and you're attempting to ask questions to figure out, through the lens of the employee, how they think and to shape their way of thinking by challenging the norms, challenging assumptions, eliciting the assumptions, identifying situational criteria, and so on, so that the employee is able to think through their tasks, the way that they are doing work right now, and whether they're doing it completely incorrectly, that they could come up with an answer themselves through the elicitation of questions by the coach. Now, it's not always the case where you'll find a solution. Sometimes it's just the way to practice a way of thinking. So I find that when people think of goals, they don't think of them very deeply, and as a result, they don't come up with very good answers. So now it requires someone with a frame of thinking to help sharpen the clarity. And this way, it's going to help you as a leader to talk to somebody, ask them questions, and they walk away with their clarity because the information comes from them, the executables come from them, and their improvements come from them. You just happen to be a facilitator of their thoughts. So in the GROW model, which is just one simple model of coaching, it already presents such a powerful direction for people to consider their own ways of thinking. Then there are many other approaches such as neuro-linguistic programming, which we don't have time to go into today, but I highly encourage you to open the doors to explore. The fifth kind of conversation is known as the influence or change conversation. A lot of people need this conversation from their leaders because it's necessary to push out new ideas, and sometimes people are just set in their old ways. So you need to let them see what power there is in this future, what kind of absolute growth they will experience, how everything is centered around this one core action, and then you motivate them, influence them, and persuade them in that direction. And sometimes the ability for you to influence is done in huge measure so that you create a massive change instantaneously, but sometimes it's also done very subtly, where you're doing a 1% change every other day, so that when people notice the change, it's like 10 years later. And as a result, they don't make very much resistance. So think about it this way. Across all of these ways of doing, you could classify the ability to set expectations and to give feedback as a managerial competency, but the ability for you to coach and influence changes within your organization as a leadership competency. However, there's one more that really takes the cake, and this goes beyond what your normal leader would do. It is known as the wisdom conversation. And in this sixth conversation, what you're really doing is you're holding the space for rationalizing difficult dilemmas, healing from conflict and trauma, and maybe even anticipating a better future so that there's a sense of encouragement, there's a sense of groundedness, and there's a sense of new perspective. After all, that's what wisdom is. I like to joke with people to tell them that wisdom means that you've been dumb so many times that you eventually became wise. Wisdom. However, it's got a sliver of truth because it's through my dumbness as a leader that I can show you that I'm exactly the same as you. It is through my dumbness as a leader that it enables me to connect with you because you wouldn't have known that I made such a stupid decision. And yet, I was able to learn. So based on those conditions, in spite of the fact that I had made a silly mistake and I could actually get to higher rungs of leadership, it must mean that you have some leeway to make some silly mistakes too. So through this process of curating wisdom, it actually enables people to feel more comfortable with you, more vulnerable with you, and also establish new perspectives that will bring you and the team closer so that they'll be able to work at a higher level of functioning that is elevated, and it enables them to put aside differences because they can now see from different perspectives. So there you have it, the 6 different leadership conversations in a nutshell. If you'd like to find out more about this, let me know and I'll do more detailed videos on this. But if you found that this was a mindset shift, that leadership is not a vested responsibility alone, but rather it's a learnable skill set. All of them are learnable skill sets across these 6 conversations, and suffice to say, I've gone through and I've developed the skills across many of these quite well over my 29-year experience as a coach, trainer, consultant, and speaker. So if you found that this was useful and you want to open those doors to your learning, more power to you. I encourage you to strive towards that and share with me some of your learnings in comments down below. If you found that this was helpful, please like and subscribe because this will give YouTube a reason to encourage others to start opening up this video for other people to learn from so that they can elevate themselves to a higher level of thinking that will transcend pain and suffering and encourage them to take more actions for abundance.